Hello, this time on Sitrep, America should restore strategic stability with Russia and rebalance its economic relationship with China. As for Europe, that's a set of decaying nations with weak leaders, and the US should cultivate resistance to that. This is not a manifesto from Moscow or Beijing, but the verdict of President Trump and his new US national security strategy. Does it matter to our defense and security, though? Mike has strong thoughts on this, and we'll also hear from a former US State Department insider. Also on Sitrep, we've talked many times about why Britain's sovereign bases are so important, yet after being caught in crossfire 50 years ago, they were nearly abandoned. And we'll explain the new high-tech blueprint unveiled by the first Sea Lord, who says his biggest concern is what's happening under the waves.
The advantage that we have enjoyed in the Atlantic since the end of the Second World War is at risk. We are holding on, but not by much.
Defense Explained.
Politico has named you as the most influential person shaping Europe.
I know the good leaders, I know the bad leaders. I think they're weak. They want to be so politically correct.
This is Sitrep with Kate Chabot and Professor Michael Clarke.
Is new US security strategy shocking? Well, maybe, but it's not exactly surprising if you've listened to anything Donald Trump has been saying for the last year. Mike, I've read your Blue Sky posts on this, so I already know, whereas the Kremlin has welcomed the NSS, you're not a fan.
No, I think the document is very inconsistent. It's a very poorly drafted document, full of contradictions, and it looks as if it's a bit of a cut and paste job, to be honest. But underneath it, underlying it, is a different ideological orientation for the future of US policy. So if the document sticks, in the sense that if it is implemented in the way it obviously wants to implement itself, then it will be a radical departure from US policy, which would be bad certainly for the Western world, but for the rest of the world as well, I think.
And if I were to cut to the chase, Mike, the standout sentence in your post reads, war in Europe is far more likely as a result. Why is that?
Yeah, because the document seems to portend an isolationist America. Now, we can argue about what that means, but undoubtedly the document is about the United States disengaging from European security. It sees NATO as a European construct, not a transatlantic construct. And I could point to 3 or 4 places in the document where clearly the assumption is that NATO is you Europeans, not we Western world people. So if the United States is, as it were, leaving the transatlantic relationship or changing the basis of that relationship, then 2 things are important. One is that Russia may be emboldened. It may feel then that this is its moment. While Trump is in power, while this document is in evidence, then this is the moment to push the Europeans to really put a hole in European security. So I think in that sense, it brings this road to war with Russia even closer. And then in a more general sense, what the document doesn't admit to is globalism. It sort of criticizes globalism as if it's a sort of a mealy-mouthed ideology. It doesn't talk about international law, except it puts it in inverted commas, saying so-called rules-based international order. And I think it sort of gives away the secret weapon of the Western world, which has always been our collective strength. And the reason that China and Russia and other malign powers like Iran and North Korea, the reason they've never had very much traction in the world is because they can never break into this sense of consensus, the collective nature of the way the Western world has operated and has operated most of the rules of the international system. And this document, as it were, gives that away as if it doesn't really recognize it at all. So for that reason, I think we are much nearer to conflict because of this document, if this document turns out to be significant. If it does, we don't know yet, but if it is significant on a journey that the United States is on, then I think the Western world is much, much weaker because of it.
OK, well, let's pause to get some context and also a view that stretches across the Atlantic. Dr Karin von Hippel is former Director General of the London-based think tank RUSI, and before that she served for 6 years as a senior official in the US State Department. So she knows the modern history of US security strategies well.
Traditionally, it would set out the strategy for the government, and then the budget would follow, just like in this country, with the strategic defense review, followed by the spending review, and it would align the entire government along the priorities of the president. With Donald Trump, things are obviously very different. He last produced one in 2017, and it was a pretty traditional Republican national security strategy. He talked about China as a pacing threat, etc. He probably didn't even read that one. He certainly didn't follow it for the rest of his term. So that document just kind of was a pretty document that people thought was pretty good, but it wasn't followed. This one's a bit different because this time, I think it was written by Stephen Miller, who's a White House Deputy Chief of Staff. And this really encapsulates Trump's view of the world and really how they're going about it. So in that sense, it's more a reflection of the way they think. Not that anybody should be surprised, because we've been hearing all of this all along. I don't really know how embassies and others are supposed to follow this, because it's quite complicated to enact some of the issues inside this, such as, making Europe change the way European countries are governed. I mean, there's a lot in there that would be quite complicated to implement.
And you say, and no one should really be surprised because we've been hearing this all along. What is your hot take then on this national security strategy?
Well, with Donald Trump, like everything, there's always an element of truth, right? And then he just goes to such an extreme. So yes, let's just take the example of what he talks about with the Europeans and basically saying, they've been taken over. Probably what they mean is by too many Muslims, but certainly European countries are no longer white and Christian. Now, they don't say that, but that seems to be the implication. But there is an element of truth that European countries, they're drowning in the weight of social welfare spending. European countries, including the UK, don't have a good grip on immigration. They all need immigration, but they don't have a good grip on it, right? And so there's element of truth in some of the implications or some of the issues that are raised in this document. But of course, it's nothing like the way they make it sound. And certainly other people would try to resolve it in these challenges in a different way.
And Karin, if you strip out the emotive elements and the bombastic language and analyse the actual substance, how big a shift is this in the US approach to the world?
So it's a huge shift. I mean, China is viewed no longer as a threat like it was in Trump's last security strategy and Biden's security strategy. They talk about mutually advantageous economic relationship with Beijing. Russia is certainly not viewed as a threat. They don't mention North Korea. They don't mention Iran beyond we bombed Iran. It wasn't that great. And so, and then they focus on, Europe and Africa. So it's a completely different type of approach, certainly something we haven't seen in decades. I'm not super worried about it because I don't really feel like they have the ability to implement a lot of what they're talking about. And of course, they're going to be surprised, I'm sure, by Russia. They'll be surprised, I'm sure, by China as well.
To that point, then, how will it actually translate into practical effect?
There isn't really a campaign plan for how to implement this. It doesn't just say, okay, this is what we hope to achieve, and this is how we will achieve it. I'm assuming other documents will come out. Don't forget the Pentagon just released their defense spending bill, and in that, there's $400 million for Ukraine. And so that completely clashes with this particular document. Now, it doesn't mean the money will go to Ukraine, and doesn't mean the president even knows that that's in the spending bill. But, as usual, it's just full of contradictions, like Donald Trump is.
Yeah, and in 4 years' time, there will be another national security strategy from a different president who may or may not have different views to Donald Trump. Can those who don't like this one actually hope just to ride it out and course correct in 2029?
No, I don't think we can just say, well, there'll be a new president in 3 years and, we'll get back to business as usual. I think the Europeans really do realize, and the Brits as well, they really realize this time that even if we get a more Europe-friendly, ally-friendly president in the next election, another Trump-like president could easily appear in the future. And therefore, European countries, the United Kingdom, need to fully deal with their own security. They need to be less reliant on the United States. And they need to do it not only to provide for their own security, but also so that they don't have to necessarily kowtow to the American president in the way we're watching so many world leaders do right now. They can just say, well, look, yes, we agree with you or we don't agree with you and we're doing this instead. But they don't have to worry about trying to please Donald Trump all the time.
Because one of the big questions from Europe is, will the US military footprint be cut here? Does this NSS point to that happening?
Well, it looks like the Trump administration does want to reduce troops in Europe. At the same time, Congress is putting together a bill trying to maintain troop levels in Europe, too. So there's going to be a battle to do this. It's very easy in some ways for those who want to keep the troops in Europe to delay and hedge and prevaricate and all sorts of tactics so that it doesn't happen. I think that's what happened the last time around. Trump did want to reduce troops in Europe and it didn't happen. This time around, he's surrounded more by people who are enabling him as opposed to people who are stopping him from doing things like last time. So it is possible they could reduce troop numbers. It would be complicated, right? Because it's actually helping the U.S. military not to have everybody back in the States, but to have them in a number of different places. There are all sorts of arrangements and legal arrangements involved in this. So it would be very complicated. And I don't quite know how they could make it happen so quickly.
And of course, the other worry for Europe is that the NSS will be seen as a green light for Moscow to do what it wants to do. Will it change thinking in Russia?
I mean, the Russians have said they like this document. That should tell you everything that you need to know. It largely coheres with their way of thinking. I think the Europeans now anticipate that Russia may try to do something in Europe by 2028. That's at least what the military chiefs have been publicly warning about. And that's why they're really going to have to try very hard to figure out how to support Ukraine in a very different way. I think the Europeans and the Brits are also very worried that the Americans may not come to the rescue if there is an Article 5 attack on a NATO country. You know, Trump has sort of half hinted that he cares, but sometimes he says, well, maybe we won't come to the rescue. If you think about how he signed an agreement with Qatar, promising to come to the rescue of Qatar, a mutual security arrangement, but he has not made such explicit commitments to NATO partners. That tells you really a lot.
Karin von Hippel, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mike, one of the things in the strategy that hasn't grabbed the headlines but does stand out to me is a goal of ending the perception and preventing the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. The word Ukraine is missing from that sentence, and yet...
Yeah, it's important. And the point is, I mean, NATO at 32 is pretty big. I mean, I've never been keen on the idea that NATO is as big as it now is, but, you know, we are where we are. And you think about, well, apart from Ukraine, who else might want to come into NATO? Well, Moldova might want to. Georgia certainly would like to at some point in the future. But it's hard to think of other nations that NATO would want to, as it were, welcome, even if they press very hard to get in. The point about this is that he got the United States, as it were, you know, putting a lid on the idea that NATO has choice. I mean, you know, NATO as a collective alliance can choose who it lets in and who it doesn't. And, you know, I have to say, again, for the nth time, that NATO is always demand-led. It's always people wanting to come in. It's not NATO trying to attract new members to it. It's everybody else wanting to get into the NATO club. And that's been the pressure on enlargement. And so it's the principle of the idea that is a problem, really, that the United States seem to be agreeing again with the Russians that somehow NATO should be legally prevented from becoming any larger. Not that it particularly wants to, or that it is going to get any larger, but the idea that somehow there should be a veto on the free expression of national interests among the NATO members. That's what's problematical about it.
But I guess playing devil's advocate, even if you're no fan of President Trump and his style, you could look at this strategy and say he's just setting out harsh realities and NATO can't get bigger, even bigger all the time. Is it better to have working relationships with Russia and China rather than ramping up hostility? Is the US not the superpower? It is not the superpower it once was, and we all have to deal with that.
Yeah, it is. And there's a difference, I think, in this respect between Russia and China, certainly from a European perspective, because, I mean, China poses many, many challenges and problems, but it's so intrinsic to, let's say, climate change or to the global economy or to influence in, you know, the global south, whatever issue you look at. When you look at the problems that China poses, you immediately realize that China is also part of the solution. It's not just a source of problems. It is actually intrinsic to some of the solutions to those problems. And that's not the case with the Russians, certainly not as far as the Europeans are concerned. The Russians are the problem. They are the problem in the sense that they have a vision of peace, which is completely different to the peaceful coexistence that we think of as somehow natural. They don't think of it in that way. way. And there's a sense of grievance with the Russians that somehow they think there's a historical injustice that has got to be addressed, and a sense of momentum that though the Ukraine war began as a massive strategic miscalculation on Putin's part, he must feel now that the world is working in his favor and that this is his moment. So the idea of regarding Russia and China as the same sort of problem is not correct, I think. China is a completely different thing, but Russia, as far as Europe is concerned, is a power that we've simply just got to face down in order to establish a more stable relationship with. And sadly, I think we've got to go back to some sort of idea of containment. We've got to have a way of living with an essentially aggressive Russia, but a Russia that doesn't actually express that aggression to the rest of us in a way that really matters. And we're not there yet by any means.
But this is a man who wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and the ambition of strategic stability with Russia does seem like a potential win for all. Arguably, he's offering Russia carrot over stick as incentive to play a bit nicer.
Well, yes, he is. And there's no indication that the Russians ever respond to that incentive, certainly not in Europe. And the Russians would love the idea of being brought out of disgrace, as it were, which they've been in certainly since 2014, and given a sort of an equal status with the United States in the rest of the world. But it won't make any difference to Russian intentions for Europe. And we know that their intentions for Europe is that the rest of us should live under a Russian shadow, because that's the only way the Russians feel safe. If they create, as it were, unstable states around their borders and that everybody else fears them. And so, as I've said before, whereas NATO always says peace through strength, whereas the Russians now say peace through fear. You know, they want the rest of the world, certainly in Europe, to fear them. And so the normalization of relations between the United States and Russia is not going to be a normalization of relations between Russia and the rest of Europe.
So it's not just about Russia, though. And if we strip back the bombastic rhetoric, and there is a lot of that, there is some strategic thinking underneath it. Just give us a rundown of the key points. What are the big changes?
Well, I suppose the most eye-catching change is the assertion that mass migration is the biggest threat to America. It's a document that's about, as it were, ideology and civilization more than strategy. So that comes through. And because of that, the United States is going to concentrate on the Western Hemisphere, which means the Americas. And it actually says that we want a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was 1823, which President Monroe said that we, the United States, will take care of everything that happens in the Western Hemisphere. And there is now supposedly a Trump corollary to that, which is that is the Americans' first requirement. So that's what they think about first. The thing they think about second is the Indo-Pacific. And the thing they think about third is the relationship with Russia and the Arctic. And the thing they think about fourth is India and the subcontinent. And then last of all is Europe, where they see nothing but decay and decline, and in a sense are distancing themselves from that. What's interesting about all of this is that we assumed last year that the American reorientation will be towards the Indo-Pacific, with the competition with China as the main feature. But it's gone one step further than that. It said, no, China is something we can manage. Russia is something we can manage. We must look after the Western Hemisphere. So this is isolationism, at least on paper, that's being given free expression. And as I say, we don't know how important this document will turn out to be. Sometimes national security strategies are just cosmetic. They're just to give a president a document to wave around to say, this is my view of the world. So it may just turn out to be cosmetic, or it may be too difficult to implement in reality because it's up against the whole establishment, which has spent 80 years doing something quite differently. But it may also be the first biggest step in a complete reorientation of the United States back into an isolationist stance, which will leave the world a much more conflictual place and will make America ultimately much, much weaker than it has been for the last decade or so.
And I know earlier you were saying we don't yet know how serious the security strategy really is, but what President Trump has said in the days since that strategy was released doubles down on the content, the pressure on Ukraine to agree a peace deal, the attacks on European leaders, and yet, as we know, he can turn on a dime.
Yeah, and as Karen was saying, you never know with Trump because he's in his own mind. He goes around in circles. He does everything on a whim or on instinct. But I think the underlying reality is that Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. He sees it as a nuisance, a war that needs to be stopped, even if one side has to surrender, so that the bigger picture of American-Russian relations can become normalized. I think that is a consistent strand in all of his going around in circles. You can see an underlying reality that what he sees in Russia is economic opportunity for the United States, and everything else is subordinate effectively to that. So he's not interested in ideology or right or wrong or legality or even genocide. It doesn't bother him very much, as long as there is a sense of long-term strategic economic benefit. That's what he looks for.
Here in the UK, there is no sign of a softening of view on the threat posed by Russia. The head of the Royal Navy, General Sir Gwyn Jenkins, has just warned that we risk losing our advantage in the Atlantic, particularly under the surface, as Moscow continues to spend billions on its maritime capabilities. We are holding on, he said, but not by much. Others have been more blunt. A former First Sea Lord, Admiral Lord West, described the UK submarine force as being in a parlous state, left without a single operational attack submarine at times this year. But there is a blueprint for the future. The current First Sea Lord gave his warning as he set out his plan for a new hybrid naval force, bringing together autonomous vehicles and AI with warships and aircraft to identify threats underwater and defend critical cables and pipelines. So we welcome back to Sitrep Captain Ryan Ramsey. He served 23 years in the Royal Navy, including 3 as captain of the submarine HMS Turbulent, and BFBS Forces News reporter Sian Grzeszczyk Melbourne, who was in the room for the First Sea Lord's speech. Hi to both of you. Welcome back to Sitrep. First off, Ryan, that claim by Admiral Lord West that at times this year we've not had any attack submarines available to operate. I don't know if you're able to verify that, but how worrying should we find it?
Yeah, well, I can verify that. I mean, it's in open source intelligence that at times during this year there have been no submarines at sea except the ballistic missile submarines. So that is true. We should be worried about it, and we should be worried about it for 2 things. We're an island nation. We need to protect our infrastructure, and we also need to provide deterrence. And deterrence in this case in the North Atlantic is to the Russians. And if we can't deploy our own submarines in order to counter them, then there's no deterrence.
And how many should we have at sea normally, Ryan?
I mean, when you think about it, the numbers that we have available to us is very low now. If you go back to the 90s when I first joined, we were in the 30s of submarines, and now we've got 7 attack submarines. And out of those 7, 1 will be training, 1 will be in deep maintenance, 1 will be in maintenance. That's 3 out of the 7 out. And then you expect at least 2 to 3 of the others at sea on operations.
Mike, how does Russia's submarine capability stack up against not just ours, but the rest of NATO?
Well, very well. I mean, the Russians deploy, a comparable number of SSBNs, the nuclear carrying submarines. I mean, there are 16 or so of those, and the Americans, I think, it's 14. And then we and the French have 4 each. So if you like, without the United States, we have an adequate force when we can keep one of them at sea at all times. But the ones that really matter, as Ryan was saying, the sort of attack submarines, on paper, the Russians can put over 25 or so at sea for the nuclear-powered submarines, attack submarines and missile-carrying submarines. And then Europe by itself, it's only Britain and France that operate SSNs, the nuclear-powered attack submarines. We're about half that number, 12 or 13 on paper. And if you look at the ones that we can actually put at sea, you're probably dealing with 4, 5 maybe at the very most. Now, the United States can double all of those numbers. It can double more or less all of the Russian numbers. But without the United States, the Europeans, we have a sort of a raft of submarines, but most of them are diesel still, and some of them are quite good. But the ones that really matter, we've got half the level of the Russians, and we find it difficult to get them to sea.
So, Sian, you were in the room for General Sir Gwyn Jenkins' speech, which he gave without notes or a script in front of him. When he said, "We're holding on in the Atlantic, but only just," what was the reaction in the room?
Well, you really could hear a pin drop, not just for that part, which was clearly the standout part of the speech, but it felt like everyone really was hanging off his every word, whereas that's really not always the case with these speeches, which sometimes they can be so full of military and government jargon that you're really not hanging off their every word because you've also heard the same lines before. And some of these speeches can sound quite safe because of that. And as you say, he ditched the official speech. He didn't stand behind the lectern, and he walked up and down the stage, which had a large floor-to-ceiling screen on it displaying a map of the Atlantic, where he reminded everyone of the basics, that virtually all our trade, data, energy flows either above, on or under the sea, and highlighted how the UK offers a key position at the cornerstone of access to the Atlantic. He had everyone's attention right from his first sentence when he said the day wasn't about canapes, it wasn't about glad handing, it was about action. And what really struck me was that if someone who knew nothing about defence had walked in off the street, they would have understood very quickly what he was getting at, what he was explaining, and they might have walked away feeling a bit alarmed at the threats we're facing, but also enlightened about where we are right now.
And Sian, arguably his warning was making the case for the Atlantic Bastion blueprint he was unveiling, underwater drones and AI alongside traditional boats, ships and planes. Just give us an overview of that plan, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about connecting autonomous sensors in the Atlantic to be our eyes and ears. And he said it's not just technologically innovative to do that. It's innovative in the approach that they're taking in terms of the way they're doing procurement with this. For every pound that they've invested, he was saying the industry has invested 4. So he was quoting figures of £500 million so far invested into research and development, and very much focusing on the fact that they're going to have to step up to use these very latest cutting edge technologies to make those connections under the water. Otherwise, we really are at risk, and that's the essence of Atlantic Bastion. But he was also talking about Atlantic Shield, which he says is our contribution to air defence from our vulnerable north, and Atlantic Strike, which is about creating the advantage if anyone does attack us, creating that perception that we can strike back well.
And Ryan, you know the undersea environment and that military job very intimately. What do you make of this plan?
Well, I think it's the right direction. The length of time it takes to procure and then build SSNs is way too slow. I mean, defence procurement is very, very slow at the moment. And actually, the only way you're going to create the defence or the layered defence that you need, and attack actually for that matter, is using SMEs to develop different systems to be able to do it. I was with Helsing last week talking to them about submarine warfare, and their product looks really, really good. But the challenge is always through the procurement process to be able to deploy this stuff rapidly and develop the tactics and develop the rules of engagement that go with this and develop operator knowledge and build up tacit knowledge about how to operate all this in the environment.
Mike, can it work?
Yeah, well, it can. As Ryan said, we put it together. I mean, Ryan, when you were with Helsing, presumably you were talking about Fathom, were you? The sort of sea glider, which looks extremely good.
Yes, and their interest was not just about Fathom for detection. Is the bit that's missing is knowledge of our enemies and how they operate. How does a submarine captain make decisions? How does the crew assimilate information? And how do you know what they're doing? Because if you decide to engage a submarine because it does one thing but you've misinterpreted it, you're just upping the stakes massively. And all this stuff needs to be thought about. And it's good to see the SMEs are doing that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point, that this will only work. I mean, the government's put 14 million in so far, which is just seed corn money, really. If it works because it brings in private industry. And as Ryan said, there's lots of SMEs out there with really good ideas for dynamic sensors. Sensors not just that you hang in the water and leave there or drop in the water, but a dynamic nest of sensors, a sort of swarm of sensors based on things like Fathom, this little sort of underwater drone, this glide vehicle, that could really look for needles in haystacks if you've got AI to point them in the right direction. So it's all feasible, but it's got to be done, and it's got to be done really quickly.
Sian, you're nodding away there.
Yeah, and he spoke about the fact that, it's not science fiction anymore, it's science fact, and we need to get, in lockstep with industry in order to harness these technologies, because, it's not going to go as slow as it is right now. It's only going to continue to get faster. And he did spend a decent chunk of the speech, talking about that and addressing it, that it is all about speed and action now because we are running out of time.
So if this plan is offering jam tomorrow, we are where we are today. What can and should we be doing, Ryan, right now about this?
Well, we should be moving at speed. So the procurement process, or the standard procurement process, is too slow. Therefore, it becomes an urgent operational requirement to bring these things, piece them together, do the tactics, and you could get stuff out to sea very, very quickly. We should be also using British companies as well. I mean, Helsing are amazing. It's German company, it's European innovation, but there are British companies as well that are doing this stuff. So if you look at battery storage, there's a company up in Scotland called Volume, which does battery storage for offshore. You could use that in order to power underwater drones as well. There's loads of solutions here to be able to do it, but it needs somebody to drive that through.
Absolutely right. We all know what we can achieve, and in a way the creation of the Atlantic net, the creation of the systems to work out what's going on is more feasible. But as Ryan said, the problem is going to be the hard power bit of it, getting enough submarines and aircraft that allow you to enforce the Atlantic Bastion idea. We know we can create Atlantic Bastion as an area that we have better knowledge of and can see what's happening. But then what are you going to do about it? That requires hard power, which is ships and aircraft and submarines. And the procurement process for those is far, far too slow.
So, Sian, without wishing to go too far down a rabbit hole of politics, I gather General Jenkins' speech has rather ruffled feathers in Whitehall.
Yes, just before he started his speech, because he was on mic, we heard something along the lines from him as to, I won't be needing those. And that must have been the moment whoever was meant to be handing him his carefully prepared, crafted paper copy of the speech gulped and wondered what was going to happen next. And an MOD source confirmed to me that, of course, special advisors, as you would expect them to, worked on his speech. The Navy didn't get the final draft until the Friday, I was told by a Navy source. But as we know, he did the whole thing without notes. He went a bit rogue, and I'm told there has been fallout inside the MOD. They're not happy because they feel it's been perceived that what he was saying was that there isn't enough money.
So, Mike, you've been in the room for bold statements from top officers before now. General Sir Nick Horton's first big speech as CDS at Russia, where he warned of hollowing out of the forces in 2013. I just wonder if newly appointed chiefs have a tendency to try and put down a marker at the start, knowing they'll have to fall into line later on.
Oh, that's a very shrewd observation, Kate. Yes, of course they do, because they want to establish their authority, the chief, and the sense that they know what they're talking about. And I remember Patrick Sanders as well, when he became Chief of the Army, Chief of the General Staff. I mean, his first speech, I was sitting right in front of him, and he said, this is Operation Mobilise. We've got to now prepare the army to go to war. Not operations, but war. And that was pretty dramatic stuff. And that ruffled some feathers in the MOD as well. So I think in one sense, yes, you can expect new chiefs to do this sort of thing. On the other hand, the chiefs are really trying to speak truth to power now, and they're all doing it, and the reason they're doing it is because that's the way they see it. And I think the other thing here that Sian kind of hinted at is that Gwyn Jenkins, he does have real charisma. He knows he does, and that sort of leadership, that charisma, is really important. You know, he's the first Royal Marine to be First Sea Lord, so he appears, you know, in what looks to most people like an army uniform, not an admiral's uniform, and that makes people sort of sit up. And he does have that leadership charisma, and that's an element that is really important if we're going to be strategically more active.
Ryan, using that charisma, do you think the First Sea Lord was also trying to say something to the men and women of the submarine service?
Yes, I think he was. I think everybody recognises, particularly the ballistic missile submarines, the Vanguard class. The crews have gone through just hell the last few years. The length of those patrols, I can't understand how they've done it. It's absolutely amazing. So there's a bit that says we're coming. I think the problem for submarine leadership at the moment is that they're just firefighting all the time. That's all they can do. They can't think strategically because they have to firefight to try and get the platforms that are alongside back to sea. The defence infrastructure that's necessary in order to maintain them isn't in place and needs to be overhauled. It's ageing beyond belief, and they're just fighting that. So I think the First Sea Lord's given clear direction that this is the direction we're going to go, and that will be buoyant for the excuse the pun, but that'll be buoyant for the submarine service.
Great to have you on Sitrep. Ryan, Sian, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, finally this week, how different would Britain's armed forces be if we did not have our sovereign military bases in Cyprus? Because it could have happened when the British government deemed them a liability half a century ago. The bases had placed Britain perilously close to being dragged into combat after a coup against the Cypriot president and an invasion by Turkey. A new book details the stories of how British forces were caught up in it all and tries to dispel the myth that they were somehow part of a conspiracy. Andrew Southam is the author of Cyprus 1974.
The Foreign Secretary at the time, James Callaghan, was under a lot of pressure to get involved because Britain was, along with Greece and Turkey, on paper, in a treaty, a guarantor of the political stability of the island. And there was a lot of pressure for him to get involved on the Greek side and on the Turkish side for different arguments. And there was, in fact, on one occasion when UN troops from a number of nations, but significantly British as well, was a large British contingent wearing blue berets, were protecting the airport in Nicosia. It became very tense overnight as the operations centre, Aktiri, watched or monitored the Turks getting ever closer to the line of the British troops wearing UN berets, and they managed to stop. They got the word from Ankara, these are the Turkish troops, to stop just in time.
So it came that close, it really did.
It came remarkably close. I mean, what would have happened? It was amazing. One dreads to think what would have happened had troops fired upon each other. Now, of course, the Turks had no real intention of firing on British troops whatsoever and completely respected them. And there were many other instances of that, because Jonathan Aitken, who was the air commander in charge of all British forces on Cyprus, had many dilemmas throughout this conflict. And another is including a huge naval operation, a flotilla, again, one of the largest, possibly the largest since the Second World War, to go around various edges of the coast and pick up people, literally flying flags, flying the Union Jack. And again, it could have involved a dispute with Turkish ships who had declared it a non-sailing zone. And in the end, messages were sent to the chiefs of staff in Turkey saying, we assume that any attempt by you to interfere with our operation will be an error on your part and will involve significant effects. And to give you one example of how close that became, how tense the situation was, Turkey attacked and sank some of their own destroyers. They thought these were Greek ships. So it's a real confusion.
And at the end of it all, the UK government wanted to give up the bases.
Yes, I mean, there are a number of reasons. They decided in the official reports, I mean, from the Foreign Office and even some, although it was a mixed view, from the Ministry of Defence, well, that from our perspective, from the British perspective, we were hostage to fortunes. Potentially, you've exposed two bases to ethnic violence, which could easily have spilled over, and we haven't spoken about. There are other incidents where foreign troops came very close to entering on British soil, sovereign bases. Or it was a miracle that no British troop and no British civilian, be it expat or serviceman, was killed. There were an array of stories how they could have been caught up. And for all these reasons, everyone decided, well, why are we there? Now, there was an obvious reason. We were there for Western interests. But the view was, in the background of a very tough defence review, when the Americans, much like today, the mirror of today is very interesting, the Americans under Nixon were insisting that NATO increase its defence spending. And that was the reason, or one of them, why Britain was eventually forced to stay, because there was a set of very tense discussions at the intelligence level, at the political level, and at the military level with the Americans, who said, you can't leave Cyprus.
It's such a rich story in terms of geopolitical threads there that you're outlining. And another one of the very fascinating details that comes out is that even BFBS played a part in the very fast-moving events of the first few days.
Oh, absolutely. It was crucial. It was a crucial way for certainly Jonathan Aitken to relay crucial messages to families who were cut off on the first night of the coup d'etat. The violence was too great for all the servicemen. They were mostly servicemen and some service ladies, but mostly servicemen, stuck on the bases to get home overnight. And there was all this fighting going on, and the only messages were ones relayed over BFBS.
In the event of any trouble, make for the shelter of the nearest building and stay put until the trouble is over.
And there was this delightful, terribly English sense of always, now stay calm, pack your bags and drink lots of tea. You know, this sense of reassuring sense of English being relayed.
We are doing our best to secure your safety. Clear and precise details of evacuation arrangements will be broadcast over this station.
But also, of course, Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots were trying to listen in as a reliable source of communication. And it was one of the earliest forms, not quite the earliest, but one of the earliest, to let people know that Macarius was still alive, because in the first 24 hours, everyone, including most Cypriots, thought he had been killed, because that was the intention. By good luck, he wasn't in the car that was destroyed by a bomb, which people thought he had been.
Thank you for that. And thanks for talking about it, Andrew. Your book is called Cyprus 1974, Conflict in the Mediterranean, No Control, No Conspiracy. Andrew Southam, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And that is just a small taste of our conversation. You can hear the full thing, including much more from BFBS broadcasts at the time, in an extra edition of BFBS Sitrep online now, wherever you get your podcasts. Mike, it seems unthinkable now that we might have given up the sovereign bases. Where would we be now if we had?
Oh, yeah. If you go back and forth to Akrotiri, it's astonishing. It's a big base and it's a logistics hub, a transport hub. It's an important base in its own right, centre for intelligence collection, lots and lots of things. We'd struggle without it. Same as Gibraltar. You go to Gibraltar and immediately you see the importance of this base to our defence. So it's really important. And, you know, just as a footnote from me, I don't know if this is in Andrew Southam's book, but when the crisis broke out in 1974, as he said, James Callaghan was the Foreign Secretary. And the message came through very early in the morning that there was a major crisis, and James Callaghan was woken up and had to get to the Foreign Office. And for some reason, the Foreign Office car either didn't turn up or was too late. So Callaghan went into the street and he commandeered the first vehicle he could find to take him to the Foreign Office. And so there we are in the middle of a crisis. He said, I'm the Foreign Secretary, take me to the Foreign Office. And he turned up outside the Foreign Office in a Home Pride bread van.
Needs must. What a nice image to end it on. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to all of our guests. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back next Thursday when we will be dusting off the Sitrep crystal ball and gazing into 2026. If you do have any questions to test Mike's prediction powers, you can put them in the comments section of this podcast. He'll look forward to that. Or send us an email, sitrep@bfbs.com. Till then, from me, Kate Chabot, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.